Inflation in New Zealand is currently sitting at 3%. 3%, that's right at the upper limit of the target band that we would like to see inflation between 1 to 3%. Now, a lot of us have been told, well, we don't need to worry about that. We'll look through this and it should be 2%-ish, right in the target, middle of that target band by 2026. So don't really worry. But as I continue to tell people, I think it's too simplistic to tell people don't worry about inflation because your expenses are still going up. Things are becoming more expensive. We live in a system where this is baked into it. So we have to constantly worry about inflation, not, or don't worry about it as much because it's not as high as it once was. No, shit is now 3% dearer than it was 12 months ago. And that is 2.2% dearer than it was 12 months prior to that, when it was 5.6% dearer than the year before, when it was 7.2% dearer than the year before that, when it was only 4.9% dearer than the year before that. Do you know what I mean? So the costs continue to compound and things become more expensive. So I think simply telling people, oh, don't worry too much about inflation is almost a little bit unfair and not realistic to the reality that we live in. So, I think we do need a healthy worry and skepticism about that kind of narrative of, oh, don't worry too much about it and it'll continue to come down. I guess the concerning piece is that it's gone from 2.2% September 2024 to then 2.5 by March 2025, 2.7 by June 2025, and 3% by September 2025. And I think some of the biggest drivers of that in this announcement this time are around rates and what you pay. That is, can we see rates coming down or coming down fast? I don't know, So I think councils are still going to need to spend and whatnot. I'm just not close enough to that local government stuff to know what they are going to do about rates. But when you've got a government that's then saying, oh, we're going to look at doing rate caps and things like that, obviously they're concerned about rate inflation as well, because it's obviously driving up costs for people's households. Now, I've done so many videos about inflation now. I've talked about this since about 2021. But I think in New Zealand, we don't tell people enough that you're going to need to learn a high income skill and you're going to have to learn how to combat inflation inside your household, because purely relying on the government to give you a income increase that after tax is in line with inflation, it's not playing out very well. And neither you're potentially your employer as well, and your employer in a very tough economy. So for you to be able to keep up with inflation, you've got to then figure out, well, how do I bring extra income into my household? And this is, business 101 for those who may be self-employed or are in business, is that you've got to keep an eye on your costs, and then if your costs are growing, you're going to have to figure out, well, how is my income going to increase to cover those things too. And it's realistically, it's not much different for a household. If you have a set income but your costs continue to increase, your gap is becoming smaller. So you can either try and cut through some of those costs, which was all fun to talk about for the first sort of 18 months of that inflationary period, until everyone was like, oh shit, okay, we've kind of done all of that. What do I do now? My insurance keeps going up, my rates keep going up, my food keeps getting more expensive. Fuel's expensive, power's expensive. I can't cut those things out. A lot of these things we can't cut out. So your only other option is then to start to learn to increase your income. But that's where Kiwi people switch off, because it's just not the done thing to talk about. And I think we've lost a little bit of our entrepreneurial and creativity way of, okay, I'll find a way. I'm very lucky I grew up in a resourceful family where it was just ingrained in us. We would have to look for ways to try and increase income because we didn't have enough income. So, whether it was selling pine cones or me going to university at 17 and selling feijoas out the front of the house, it's just what I've been doing for a big portion of my life. And the beauty of kind of growing up without much is that you do then learn some of those entrepreneurial skills if you should choose to, because other people would disagree and say, no, you don't. You grow up without them, and therefore that's why you're on the back foot. But I just choose not to look at it that way and think that I've been very lucky to grow up in a resourceful environment, and it's now being very rewarding and very valuable for me stepping into business and stepping into an inflationary environment where I've then had to try and figure, okay, how am I going to combat this as well? But love to know what you think. Where do you think inflation is going to go to from here? I just can't trust the politicians and the economists and stuff when they so over optimistically just be like, oh, don't worry, it'll be 2% next year or whatever. Even if it is 2%, 2%, things are still more expensive. You've got to be thinking about increasing your income. Your money's losing its value. So what was once 100,000 is nowhere near what $100,000 income now is. And what was once $1 million of assets is not what $1 million of assets used to be like. So you have to learn about this in New Zealand because this is the system in which we live in. But I think what's interesting with inflation coming out at 3% is that I think the current government have been sort of trying to claim credit for inflation decreasing and suggesting that they're doing a great job, and that's why inflation has been coming down. So it'll be interesting to see sort of what their narrative is when now they can't really say that. They've seen inflation drop back down into that 1 to 3% band, and now it's right at the upper of the band. So it's gone right down to 2.2%, and then it's 2.5, 2.73, and it's gradually increasing, which is quite confronting for them, but also doesn't really fit with the narrative of what they were talking about. So yeah, it's not great. Like, inflation is not a great thing for us to have to deal with. But it's part of the system that we live within, and we need to try and figure out what we can do to combat that. And obviously there's suggestions around gold and cryptocurrencies and buying assets and things. And I think, from my time learning about money and accounting and business and economics and things like that, and by no means am I an expert, but there's been so much content over the decades of you need to take your income and swap it for assets, buy assets, and that's because people understand that money is losing its value, and so then you need to try and convert that money that you're earning into a form of asset that may hold its value. So yeah, that's what I think we're seeing play out with so many people now learning about buying shares or gold or crypto and things like that, because they're learning that I think this is what those people were saying. So people are more and more doing that behavior as well. So if you're not thinking about increasing your income or buying assets, well, you got to ask yourself, like, why not? We've just lived through a very intense inflationary period, and people have probably been trying to tell you, like, this is why you need to think about assets and things that are going to hold their value, because this is what's happening to your money. It is losing its value, and it always does. So yeah, where does that end? I don't know. Some people may speculate in the comments, but it doesn't sound like a great system to be inside. But kind of how it's been since I've been a young father, and doesn't look like it's slowing down anytime soon as well. Now, the latest CPI figures show annual tradable imported inflation went up 2.2%. However, prices were recorded for overseas accommodation prepaid in New Zealand, which went up 9.6%, and meat and poultry jumped 12.2%. You can dig into all this data. They were partly offset by telecommunication equipment, which decreased by 15.2%. Petrol was down 1.6%. The top three contributors to annual inflation: electricity up 11.3%. It contributed 10.1% to the 3% annual CPI increase, while rent was up 2.6%. I thought rents were coming down. Local authority rates and payments were up by 8.8%. Top three contributors make up 17% of the weight of the CPI basket. I made another video a while back about how you just have to be realistic too. If you've got insurance, power, rates, and food, those are big things that a lot of us can't avoid in our life and are going to have to spend money on. So although the general basket of goods might only be increasing at 3% per annum, only, your household level of inflation for yourself. Somebody I interviewed on a podcast recently said that they went back and they reviewed their costs of their household compared to 2 and 3 years ago, and were blown away at their household level of inflation to buy all of those same things. So this 3% can be oversimplified as well. But I just think that at a very high level, 3% inflation sucks for so many Kiwi people, because there's just no way that they have a after-tax increase of their income of 3% to cover the costs of goods going up in their household at a general basket of goods level. And then if you then go to a food, a power, a rates, etc. level, well, how the hell are their pay rises keeping up with that? And that's why I'm always banging on about increasing your income, because it's just the cold, hard, undeniable truth about trying to stay on top of it. Is you have to learn how to bring more income into the household, and we don't teach people about how to do that. So you need to swap a high value skill for money, and add value to somebody else's life, and you increase the likelihood that you get paid, and you've got to then pay the government more tax to have some left over to then cover the rising costs in your family. Um, but yeah, for most people, like they won't be able to have a pay rise that after tax will cover the increased costs that they're facing in their household. And I think that is the number one thing driving the frustration for Kiwi households about how things don't feel great, because inflation is still sticky and it sucks.